is the DAWbench Radio Show, the official podcast of DAWbench.com.
Welcome to the DAWbench Radio Show. I am your host, Curigliano of AAVIM Technology in Melbourne, Australia, and I'm joined again by Pete Brown of Microsoft in Maryland in the United States. How you going, Pete?
Good. How are you doing, Vin?
Yeah, I'm good, man. You know, considering the hour, but let's not bore the listeners of me having to get up at this ungodly hour. But I'm good, mate. I'm good. Mate, the last week was just a blur for us. We had Evan on a week ago, and today
that was such a good podcast.
It was great, yeah. And I'm still in the middle of just putting the final touches on that one. Now today we have a very special guest, and that is Mark Jeffery, who was the original architect for several early versions of Pro Tools and currently a senior engineer at AVID. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you so much. Appreciate your hosting today's event and looking forward to a lot of reminiscing.
Yes, and thank you for your time and energy, because there is an amazing amount of history. Pro Tools needs no further explanation for anyone who's been involved with computer-based digital audio production over the last 30 years. And even just saying that is kind of scaring me. And despite the fact that, look, we only chatted for the first time last week, it's safe to say we share a lot of that history. My initial experience with Pro Tools' earliest inception was more of a close observer. I worked with some high-level Mac colleagues that were all over those first versions right from the get-go. And then when it moved to Windows, I moved more into the front line and hands-on, and I'm still there. I'm still here today. And of course, you've been there since day one. Well, actually,
minus a few years, I guess.
Yeah, pre-day one, because you've got some really cool history with the company pre-Pro Tools. So I think to kick this off, it would be really cool if you can give us an overview of your personal history with music computers and technology, your path to joining Evan and Peter at Digidesign, and the eventual journey to fathering Pro Tools.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. I was thinking back, and we could really start in the year of 1976, because that's when I started high school.
Right.
And I went to San Mateo High School, and at that school, there was a very cool rock band called Foxfire that featured. Oh, yeah. And if it was the, spring prom or whatever, chances are they were providing the musical entertainment. And that band consisted of Peter Gotcher on drums and Evan Brooks on keyboards.
Brilliant.
And being an aspiring musician myself, of course, I kept close tabs on what are these guys' names? Wow, they're amazing. And if only I could play as well as them. And I, was just starting out on guitar myself. So, I was aware of these guys. And of course, I was just a lowly freshman in high school. I think they, I am quite certain they didn't know anything about me, but I was looking up to them. Anyways, fast forward a few years later, it's time to go to college. And I go to UC Berkeley, which is kind of a convenient choice, being a San Francisco Bay Area native. I have no idea what I'm going to pursue, but I try out this thing called computer science. And I like it. It's sort of like solving puzzles and putting things together, being creative, using your mind creatively. And, you have to think back to 1980. Yes, there were computer hobbyist people, but computers were on the fringe of mainstream society. I would say that a low percentage of households had a personal computer. There was just Apple IIs and things like that. But soon things changed. And I think the advances that both IBM made, of course, and the, sort of DOS platform, and then Apple Macintosh really made computing more palatable. But it was, not such a, I guess, glamorous. That's probably not the right word.
It was just for the nerds. Only
it was for the nerds. Exactly. That's what I'm looking for. It was completely a nerdy type of a, major, but I enjoyed it. I got a degree in it. And I graduated in 1985. And of course, all the while I knew about Peter and Evan, and they continued to play in various bands. And actually, Evan's sister was a friend of mine. And I said to Rachel Brooks, I said, Rachel, what's your brother up to? And she told me, well, he's started a music software company. And in 1985, when you combined music and software, it might have been, like laser beam pizza delivery, something, it's like, what is that? That sounds fantastic. I love pizza. I love lasers. I'm in. What can I do? So I, with the help of Rachel, got in contact with Evan and set up a job interview. I think the bar was fairly low for me to get in. And I think that maybe there's 2 questions in the interview, something like, what bands do you like and when can you start?
Brilliant.
Maybe what programming languages do you know? But, anyways, I was in, and it was fantastic. It was a great, can't even say corporate culture. It was Peter and it was Evan and it was, kind of a couple other people, that were in and out of the picture, but it was very small. And of course, as Evan very well outlined in your prior podcast, that the meat and potatoes of the business was, programmed ROMs, right? Proms that could be plugged into drum machines. And believe it or not, in 1985, that was a thriving business, right? Because everybody had their Drumulator or their Lindrum or their Oberheim DX or their whatever. And the ability to swap out a snare drum sound was, revolutionary. But anyway, so my first job at Digidesign was to write a very simple app called Midi Composer. And it was a $29 MIDI sequencer app. And the reason that we were basically contracted to write this thing is because Evan, being a really talented, not only software engineer, but hardware engineer, had designed a MIDI interface for the Macintosh.
Right.
And so there's a company called Assimilation that made trackballs and things like that. There's like, sure, we want to get in on this MIDI thing, whatever it is, because not many people, it was a sort of a new buzzword around that time. So, all right, we're going to sell these MIDI interfaces and we need a little app. And so basically I wrote this, 4-track. And of course, 4 tracks is a completely artificial limitation that was nothing more than we were emulating a Porta Studio.
Oh, right.
So if you all remember Porta Studios, they were 4 tracks. So I think at least half of my time developing that software was trying to come up with all the bit maps to create an animated cassette with the hub spinning. And there was there was Mac Paint, but if you wanted to incorporate graphics into your software, you actually had to input them in hexadecimal. So, a bit, of course, it was 1-bit graphics. And so I would take out a piece of grass paper and fill in squares or leave squares blank to decide if I had a black pixel or a white pixel, and then convert that into a hexadecimal number and put it in a file, which is just insane if you think about what you can do now graphically.
It's how we did like game sprites and stuff for the Commodore way back then too, yeah.
Precisely. Anyway, so Midi Composer was a 4-track MIDI sequencing, I guess you could call it. I mean, it was very simple. There's actually no editing, no graphic display of notes, no nothing, just tracks that could be record enabled. And of course, if you're using that, you might have been using a little Casio CZ101 or something like that, which at least that's what I was using.
Yep.
But it was a great start, and it was a great way to learn Mac programming because, of course, at that time, Digidesign was sort of a Macintosh platformed company. Of course, later we grew up and branched out and got together with Windows machines, of course. But that'll be for later. But at that time, we were just developing for Mac. So then the next thing I did was a port. So Sound Designer is a very successful app. It really was a great complement to the emulator. And so at that time, 1985, digital sampling was a really important thing. And you had, of course, sequential circuits coming out with their first sampler called the Prophet 2000. And so while Evan was advancing the capabilities of Sound Designer, my job was basically to port his code into a different app that would support the Prophet 2000. And any version of Sound Designer at that point really had two halves. It had the waveform, the digital audio editing and processing, and it had the control panel. So with any sampling keyboard, you'd want to lay out all your samples across the keyboard. And, it was so much easier to do it using a computer than doing with all the little displays that machines had back then, right? With a little 7-segment,
Yep.
A few digits or something.
Yep. We discussed that with Evan on the last show, trying to loop samples with a hexadecimal display on an Ensoniq Mirage. Gee, that was fun.
Oh, the Mirage was the worst. I'm sorry. I apologize to you for what you went through. Not that Ensoniq didn't create some great music technology, but the Mirage.
Oh boy,
and what you had to go through to do sampling with that was tough.
It was a challenge.
Anyway, yes. So fast forward a little bit. So that we were into 1986, I'm sure at this point, and I did another port of Sound Designer for the Korg sampling keyboard, and I think it was the DSS-1.
That's the one, yeah.
I hope I'm right on that.
Yes,
I'm sure I'm close.
Yep.
And so then the beauty of Digidesign is that it was very engineering driven. It wasn't, a team of marketing people, saying, according to our calculus and market research, we need X, Y, and Z. It was really entirely driven by the creativity of the engineers. And of course, Peter, I kind of include in that because Peter was very, very creative. But so there's maybe a down moment or something where, what's Mark going to work on? Well, I was already working on something, and that was called soft synth. And I thought, why not do more with, there was a Car+ Strong pluck string synthesis algorithm that was in Sound Designer. And actually, Digidesign got in trouble for that because Car+ Strong were a couple of grad students at Stanford. And Stanford realized that music technology was insanely lucrative, or at least it was with John Chowning's FM synthesis. Right. So FM synthesis was licensed to Yamaha. And of course, a gazillion DX7s were sold. And it was, great technology. So Stanford wasn't about to let this little upstart company called Digidesign use Car+ Strong for free. But anyways, I forget how exactly that was resolved. I think we maybe had to remove it from our software. And I think by the time Sound Tools was coming along, nobody really cared that much about this stuff anyways. But in any case, I thought, wouldn't it be cool to do additive synthesis on a computer and then download those samples into our sampling keyboards? And, had fun kind of conceiving of drawing the envelopes of all the different partials in sort of a waterfall display, similar to how FFTs were drawn. And then eventually, actually, FM was added to that. And so anyways, I guess just point being is that there's a lot of freedom for creativity.
So Mark, these algorithms you're talking about are all fairly intensive. Was this when you guys were using the external signal processing, or was that all you were able to pack that all into the CPU on the computer?
Great question. Not yet. So the timeline of the sound accelerator card is on the horizon. And it's really probably because, we were so much more patient back then. I mean, everything now is so immediate gratification. But you would, adjust some parameters and you'd hit a compute button. And granted, I tried to make the software run as fast as possible, and you were probably synthesizing a sound that was 2 or 3 seconds long. So it wasn't painful, but none of this thing of real time, like grab a bunch of knobs, the way, of course, you would with the modular synthesizer. So it was a different mindset for sure. And yes, the sound accelerator is absolutely on the horizon, but we are almost there, but not quite. And really the chronology of this, and I'm sure there's some overlap here, but Soft Synth was kind of a cool app. And I think it sold enough copies that Peter said, well, what else do you want to do? And, I already knew the answer to that question. And was something called Turbosynth. And it's so funny to call it Turbosynth, meaning fast, because It wasn't really fast. It was still the same thing of, adjust some things and hit some parameters. But really, I called it, actually, Peter hated the name Turbosynth and tried with all his might to come up with a different name, and we just never did. And concurrently, some of the people inside the company were like, "Oh no, I like Turbosynth," and so he kind of lost a popularity battle within the company. But the main thing about Turbosynth is that it had a lot of buffering. So so basically, Turbosynth was a modular synthesizer. Not quite exactly like you'd expect it to be from an analog modular, but it was that there were nodes. And so you could import a sample, and that would be sitting on your screen, and you could wire a network up, right? So you could have a sample connected to a filter and an oscillator connected to something else, and then have those two things summed, and then have some amplitude envelope, whatever you wanted. And you just dragged out these little modules onto a blank canvas, and you connected them. And each one of those things had its own little RAM buffer, so that you didn't have to, when you finally wanted to output a sample, have everything recomputed, because most of the stuff was pre-computed in advance. And that was the quote unquote turbo aspect of this thing.
Yeah.
So, which was,
if the PCs could have 8 megahertz be counted as turbo, then you get a pass on the name.
Thank you for the pass. Yeah. I've been dying for that pass for decades now.
Hey,
okay.
Now with Turbosynth, I shared a great little story with you in the pre-chat. Remember that one of my current clients came to me a couple of years ago and said, "Hey, Vin, I've got a really weird request that hopefully you can help me with." I went, "Yeah, shoot." He says, "I need an old new bus Mac." I went, "Okay, why?" And he said, "Well, I want to run Turbosynth." And I've gone, "Okay." and so this guy had, I think it was an early audio media card and the Turbosynth package. And I hooked him up with a friend of mine that was, right into all of those older Macs and stuff. And we've got a system working. When I say he got a system working with Turbosynth, still uses it to this day, and says to me, "When you're talking to Mark, you make sure you mention that I'm still using this Turbosynth." Now, what year was Turbosynth, Mark?
I'm going to say 87.
Oh, there you go. And it's still being used in 2022. It's pretty amazing.
It's amazing. It's fantastic. And I have to say, there are some unique things that app did that nobody else did. Like there's a Spectral inverter module. So you could take your frequency spectrum and flip it backwards. So your high frequencies are low and vice versa. And just quirky things like that. And the way that I approach oscillators is I had these you could either draw the waveform, or you could then, I would do frequency analysis, basically do a little short FFT or DFT, to figure out what the harmonic content was of that waveform. And then you'd have harmonic drawbars. And you could say, all right, I'm going to just take the even partials, the odd partials. There's all these partial manipulation things. Let's spread them out differently. So there's just weird things that you could do with this thing. I'm calling it an oscillator, but really it was a time slice oscillator. So every moment in time could have a different wave shape. So it's like wave sequencing, I think is the common term for that.
Yeah. Yes.
And then you could, I think it just always crossfaded between them, but maybe you could control the crossfade length or something like that. And so, you kind of had this wave sequence. It's completely different really from, even though I say like modular synthesizer, well, modular, the analog synth would be, you could have a triangle wave, a sawtooth wave, a pulse wave, a square wave, and maybe you could modulate that. And this, being that I didn't really know how to do that, digitally. I knew how to again, coming from additive synthesis and knowing how to do FFTs and things like that, I knew how to do digital manipulations. And maybe that's the point. The digital domain and the analog domain are just different animals. And rather than trying to emulate perfectly the analog domain, I was like, I'm just going to be as creative as I can in the digital domain and do signal processing that way. And my filters were unorthodox and everything was unorthodox about it. And it was a really fun thing. And again, this was like all we had to do was sell 500, copies of this thing for it to make money for us, because we were just a fly-by-night, I shouldn't say fly-by-night, but we were kind of a small operation with low overhead. But now we're creeping towards the late 80s and, we're starting to grow up as a company and we start to add other developers. And here's where I'm going to actually pull my little notes up here because I don't want to forget anybody's name. And I think it's probably appropriate at this time to mention Rob Curry. And Rob has an interesting path in technology and has worked for a number of other companies. And he, like a lot of people, started working with Evan's playback engine, which was called HD Play. And HD Play is actually the very first audio engine preceding DAE that was used in what I'm going to call the very first digital audio workstation, which is Opcode Studio Vision, which came out before Pro Tools. And it had digital audio and it had MIDI. And it was based upon this thing called HD Play. So Rob gets hired and a lot of very talented engineers kind of came in to Digidesign through the technical support side of the company. And actually, one of the first things Rob did was as the liaison to potential software developers, because Peter Gotcher is very smart and said, let's kind of be a platform for other developers. This is the beginning of that.
All right.
And so we're going to make some hardware, but this guy, Bill Warner, who you may know his name, he is the founder of AVID. And in 1988, Rob meets Bill Warner on a street corner in Boston and hands him, I'm going to guess, like a little binder and, either a CD, probably a CD, or that might have been even early to have CD-ROMs then, but either that or a 3.5-inch floppy disk with the SDK for development for our first sound accelerator, because Bill Warner, being that he's now just starting, that's right, 88 was the beginning of AVID.
Right.
Maybe 87. He knew that, of course, he had to have sound. Like if he's going to do digital film editing, that you need sound. And this was a higher, much higher, really the only reasonable sound output that you could get out of a computer at that point, because the regular sound drivers were kind of flaky and didn't sound good. And anyways, so Rob then shows how talented he is as a software developer, and he developed 56,000 codes. That was the DSP chip that's on the sound accelerator for SoftSynth. So all of a sudden, SoftSynth actually becomes more of a real-time app where you can start in real time adjusting, the frequency of your oscillator and things like that. And actually here it changed instantly as opposed to, a second later.
Yep.
So he develops SoftSynth. He's the primary software developer of Sample Cell, which was our sampling card.
Yes.
But he's also definitely got a good inclination for management, and that's sort of where he ends up. I can't list all of his accomplishments, but he left around 94, but he became VP of software. So he was, very smart guy that was able to kind of see the bigger picture of things and not just have his nose to the grindstone looking at code, which is basically the description of my career path.
Right.
Is just leave me with the debugger. I don't really want to manage a team. So yeah, as long as I've been, you'd think that after 36 years.
Well, it'd be 30. Right? It'd be 37 shortly, wouldn't it?
Oh, that's right. It's 37 years with Digidesign / AVID that I would have, climbed the corporate Christmas tree. But no, I really truly enjoy coding, and so that's where I remain.
Awesome.
So let's see. So what else? I think it would be probably important to also mention Peter Rickert at this point. So Peter is I think, hired in 1990, so a little bit after Rob. And he kind of took over Rob's gig of developing and supporting this HD play thing. But Pete is really the father of DAE, which is the thing that was the real audio engine. So HD play was kind of a mechanism to play a playlist of, two stereo audio.
Yep.
So it was just sort of stereo audio. That was it. That was all HD play was ever going to be. And so to do real multi-track concurrent playlisting, we needed something more. And of course, we needed something that might have built-in effects and things like that. And so it was time for a rethink on the audio engine. And Pete Rickert was the guy really that did that. Mm-hmm. And Pete, so Pete started in 1990, which was the same year, that we started development of Pro Tools. And I guess what we thought would be the quickest path to get a Pro Tools multi-track app out is to partner with a company. And so we partnered with this company, OSC, who on their own, and this kind of comes full circle to maybe back to Rob Curry, was one of these companies that developed for these sound cards that we created. So the first one was called Sound Accelerator. The second one was called Audio Media.
Yes.
And as with most technology, in some ways, Audio Media was better than the thing that was more expensive and preceded it, but whatever. So OSC created an application called Deck, which was really cool. And it was actually, mentioning the Portis Studio, it was kind of the same idea. It was 4 tracks of digital audio now, not MIDI. And it's running on our card, which has a DSP chip, a Motorola DSP chip called the 56000. And wow, that looks great. They kind of beat, we probably should have been developed that product, but they developed it before us. But, Peter was smart and said, well, these guys have a lot going. They're talented. Let's partner with them. And we want to create something that we're going to call Pro Tools. And so I wrote Pro Edit. So what Pro Deck did not have, which was the thing that was paired with Pro Edit, was any kind of waveform editing or anything like that. And that was sort of the staple of what Digidesign did, right? We had Sound Designer, we had sound tools, we displayed waveforms, we could trim them. And so it was a very free time. So Peter just trusted me. He's like, all right, Mark, I want you to write this thing. I have some ideas. I want to have, we have this playlisting feature in sound tools. So we'll just have multiple playlists in this thing. And I kind of pushed back on that idea because the playlist in Sound Designer and Sound Tools was text-based. So the workflow in Sound Designer was that you would select a range of time in the waveform and go, okay, this is my verse or my this or my that, my hit. And I'm going to name it. And then you'd have thereby just a textual named element. We called it a region. And then you would sequence those regions in a text-based playlist. And if you think about it or just look at it for more than a few minutes, you realize, well, how do I, these playlists are not going to be in sync with each other. And how are you going to see the relationship between these things? You can kind of align, you can leave gaps in a text-based playlist that sort of align things, but if something's just slightly ahead of another thing, and you don't want to see all these like time code numbers or bar and beat numbers or whatever the timing reference was at that time, I forget. So the idea of, no, actually the waveform display is a great place to also do your sequencing of your clips. And so, and as completely obvious and that everybody does that now, that was a new idea in 1990. And so I developed Pro Edit. And we worked well with the OSC guys. I should give a shout out to Mats Myberg and John Dalton, who were the developers there, and Josh Rosen, who kind of was the leader, the president or CEO or whatever they had for their corporation, and is a smart guy. So a bunch of smart guys. And that was Pro Tools 1.
Right.
And unfortunately, it was a bit of a hack, right? So we have this Pro Deck thing, and we have 2 different applications running at the same time, trying to share the same sort of session file format. And it was just kind of clunky. You really didn't want to have to switch applications to do, to go back and forth between these two. And the decision was made that Pro Tools 2.0 would be built on top of Peter Rickert's DAE, and that it would be an integrated single application that would have both a mix and edit window.
Yep.
And so that came to pass. And at this time, so I think we're well into 1990. So Pro Tools 1.0 comes out in 1991. So I'm going to guess that Pro Tools 2.0 would have been a year later.
1993, actually.
93, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and at this point, Doug Tissier has been hired, and he's now working alongside Peter Rickert on DAE. And I just want to kind of mention all the contributions that Doug made to Digidesign / AVID. He started in 91. He left in 2011.
Right.
So he started, like a lot of people did, kind of in the test side of things or the developer support side of things, not so much in there writing the main applications, but, once somebody proves their mettle doing test apps, they end up where they can contribute, more significantly. Mm-hmm. So he helped write things like, the TDM manager, which is this whole network of how do you have a bunch of different plugins on a bunch of different tracks and have their signals flow in the proper direction to end up in the right place. And then most importantly, you're loading plugins, into DSPs, and you are then controlling those plugins, right? So there's a whole control path that needs to be set up. So that's all really significant under the hood work. And Doug and Pete Rickert were working side by side on that. Mm-hmm. And then eventually Doug migrates to be more of an applications engineer. And so and again, this is, I think, another example of something where nobody's asking for it, but if an engineer had enough chutzpah to do something, that he would just go ahead and do it. He or she, I should say. But in Doug's case, adding QuickTime support to Pro Tools, it's like, oh, I see the APIs here. I think we could add this, a video window into Pro Tools. So, Doug does that, and he's involved in Audio Suite, which is where we realized that it was necessary to render, all these plugins that we have supported in our TDM framework to be able to, sort of run in a non-real-time mode in order to print them just on tracks. Mm-hmm. And actually faster than real time, which was an important thing. And then Doug does a bunch of work to really, not that MIDI is that great in Pro Tools. It's always been more of a focus of an audio app than a MIDI app, but Doug did a significant amount of work to improve what was, the MIDI capabilities of Pro Tools. And then he goes on, he wrote the Verify plugin. He did Sibelius integration. So he definitely left his mark. And I'm sure there's many other things he did that I'm not even remembering. But but anyway, so Doug, going back to 1991, this is, that's sort of when Doug joins the team. And then another person who joins the team around this time is Reiner Broderson. And Reiner is our Windows guy. So it's like, okay, let's be smart here. This Windows platform is actually bigger than the Macintosh platform. And it's great that all these, sort of niche music technologists are happy to buy Macintoshes. But, there's a lot that is to be offered on this other platform. And this is where you'll have to double check the historical records. But Session 8 was kind of Reiner's baby. And it was this parallel audio app that was sort of kind of conceived from the ground up as being different than Pro Tools. And I think at that time we were kind of looking out at the world at, like Ford Motor Corporation, where they got a Mustang, but they also have a sedan. They have this or that. And like, why don't we have different apps with different features, and maybe, then people can have their choice or something like that. And there's nothing, I guess, specifically wrong with that thinking other than the fact that you're completely duplicating effort to accomplish a lot of the same things. And maybe automobiles and digital audio workstations are just different animals, and you don't need as much variety with the DAW. You just need really good ones. You just need one great one that does everything.
Yep.
So anyway, but, major shout out to Reiner. And actually I was remembering one little anecdote that I think is slightly humorous. And that's that at the time that we were creating DAE, so we had to give it a name and we couldn't think of a name. And so somebody said, Fred. Why don't you just call it Fred? Just give it a name like a human being. Does it really need to be an acronym? And then Reiner said, oh yeah, Fred is cool. And then I said, Fred is cool. Let's call it Fred is cool. Let's call it FIC. Now we have a 3-letter acronym. So the thing that is funny about this is that Reiner is German, native of Germany. And apparently FIC is a very naughty word.
Naughty word in
the German language. And he's just smiling the whole time.
This is the divide between engineers and marketers right there, I think. So.
There it is. Yes, now we've realized how crucial it is to have good marketers in the organization. Yes, at this exact point. Anyway, and our German developers kind of snickered at us and like, why'd you call it?
FIC, yeah.
Anyways, but big shout out to Reiner, hugely important for getting the ball rolling on our Windows development, back at that time. And then I'm not sure when he left Digidesign, but he certainly made his impact. Yeah.
Hey, can I make a quick point? And it's an important one that when we're talking about the the evolution of DAWs, and with every one of my other developer guests that I've had, we were primarily talking about, we were talking about software only. Now, what differentiates Digidesign's efforts in those early days was that it wasn't only software. You always partnered with hardware, and it was very specific hardware. So you couldn't run the software without the hardware. Now that remained pretty much up until about 2009, 2010, somewhere around there when it moved to Pro Tools 9. Now we'll get to that, but that was a very significant shift because till then you guys it was a very locked system, very closed system. You had very specific hardware, and of course, there was, obviously there was reasons why you wanted to maintain that type of control.
I see where you're going with this. It's as if we had marketing genius, and that would be nice, but I think it was simply that we wanted to get this thing to happen, and none of us were going to be able to afford a Synclavier or a Fairlight. Yeah. And it was just sort of the obvious only route to take at those junctures, because there really wasn't, sort of third-party digital audio hardware that would plug and play. No, I mean, we had to invent all that stuff.
Yeah, not in the 90s, definitely not in the 90s, Yeah. And look, in the way I see Pro Tools, I see it in 3 significant eras. One was obviously the 90s, where everything was just, you guys were growing with the technology as the technology was increasing, and the hard drives were improving, and then the bus architectures of the computers were changing from new bus to PCIX, and then when you went to PCIX, that also opened you up to Windows machines, and so the 90s would, that was a crazy time because you would have been developing on your feet. The stuff was developing so quickly. Then the second period I see is I call it the noughties, right? So from 2000 to 2010 was that period where you were starting to loosen up a little bit with the closed hardware, and we can go into more detail with that. And then from 2010 on, then you opened it up, and that was the significant change where you opened it up, but you also still maintained the dedicated hardware with HDX. So I see it as 3 periods. Those 90 then the periods of the 90s with TDM. So this is how I differentiate it. So we had the TDM and then Pro Tools TDM. then we had Pro Tools HD in the noughties, and then we had HDX. Now, I know there's a lot happened in between all of those, but they're the three significant eras for me for Pro Tools.
Yeah, that completely makes sense.
Yeah.
And I would say internally, there was kind of a major shift when we realized that Motorola wasn't really going to continue to develop the DSP chips that we're using and make them, follow Moore's law,
yes.
right? And be, twice as fast every however many years. And so we did a major shift of transitioning from Motorola to TI.
Yes.
And so that from a sort of software architecture shift and where we went into what we call AAX plugins, which are compatible both with TI as well as host processing.
Yeah, and we're kind of jumping ahead because prior to AAX, we had Artes, which is the real-time audio suite.
Yes.
So
very good.
I think what we should do, and I'm sorry if I've kind of, we've leapfrogged it. I think we should backtrack a little bit, maybe to, like the noughties era.
Absolutely. Yeah. So let's go right back to that. And let's mention two names that I mentioned before, Peter Rickard and Doug Tissier.
Yes.
And I think Doug had started the initial work on our task and Peter finished it. And it was important. And of course, we will have to mention that, I guess it was Cubase, right? Who did the
Steinberg.
The VST plugin? Steinberg.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. And of course I guess this is an example where there's almost a role reversal because we were the kind of the young upstarts that were redefining how you could do digital audio from the very first pioneers, which would be Synclavier and Fairlight and those folks, and even EMU systems, I guess. And we're like, we sort of found the sweet spot where you could take a personal computer, which had a lot of power, that was affordable, and do a bunch of the heavy lifting with something that's relatively inexpensive and not, by the way, have to design the circuit board and do all the stuff that, takes 2 years to do. And by then the processors are all kind of a little out of date anyways. And yet create this hybrid, right? The software, hardware hybrid. And we always had that software, hardware hybrid. And then eventually we, started making our own hardware. But it was always a hybrid approach where we always leaned a bit on a personal computer and on some custom hardware that we created.
Yes.
So now getting back to Steinberg is, of course, we loved the fact that people had to pay money to buy the DSP farms or whatever it was that we were selling at that point in time, and that we had this, real-time signal processing environment. And Steinberg comes along and says, well, computers are fast enough now. And that was always the thing, right, is that the transition from sound tools to Pro Tools was the transition that hard drives had the capacity not just to store your samples, but your songs that you could, have. I guess it was still megabytes then, but you had enough megabytes on a hard drive that you could use your computer now as a great 2-track with great editing, right? You could chop off the beginning and the end of your song or do a fade out or do all the little things that you do sort of in mastering or at least post mix.
Yes.
And so we went from that transition from sound designer to sound tools as general purpose personal computing technology got better and better. And it got better and better to the point where it's like, heck, we really don't need these expensive cards with these DSP chips on them if you're doing something kind of modest.
Yes.
To this day, people doing serious mixes need the DSPs. I mean, there's just no two ways about it. I mean, if we're talking about really big mixes on a soundstage for a feature film, where it's hundreds and hundreds of tracks with hundreds and hundreds of EQs and compressors and who knows what else. So if you're operating at that level, you still need the custom hardware. But clearly Steinberg identified a point in time where you didn't need custom hardware to do something not super ambitious and just to do it all natively. And so they did that. And so, yes, absolutely, Digidesign reacted to that and said, okay, we see the writing on the wall. We've been ignoring it. We can't ignore it any longer. So let's look very seriously at our tasks.
Yeah. And look, and that was a really interesting time with Steinberg VST because I'm quite close to those products. And I still remember when VST first came out, and the computers, you could run maybe a real-time reverb, 1 or 2 if you're lucky. But I still remember the reaction from when VST first came out, and especially from the Pro Tools users that were, using the DSPs in real time.
Probably get very defensive, right there.
Well, I'll just paint a picture for you. Let's just say the arms were crossed, and they were just laughing their heads off. And I'm at the NAMM show, and I've gone, guys, you're not. The bigger picture is that computers are not going to be standing still. So Charlie had a vision. He said, well, we can see what's happening. We're going to develop something that at the moment is not going to be, bearing too much fruit. But as the computer technologies expand and accelerate, this thing is going to be huge. And so he was ahead of the game a little bit there. And like you said, you guys reacted to it. I thought, this is going to be an interesting shift. We'll call it a shift.
Yeah, sure.
And again, that started the whole native versus DSP war, which is still running to this day, but it's almost flipped. Now we have so much computer horsepower that people are questioning whether you need the DSPs, but then you just made the point, huge post-production mix. You've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tracks and all these plugins.
And then maybe low latency also. If you're really sensitive to the latency, you can't get your buff. I mean, of course, if the buffer's at 64 samples and you're not at a really, it doesn't matter at sample rate, actually.
Yeah.
64 samples is just going to be pretty low latency. And then it's a question of if you've got a lot of processing, is it going to play? And if it is, then great.
There's always a balancing act. And my main focus over the last 20 years, at least, has been native DAWs. And so I've had some close friends at Digidesign /AVID over the years where I had a development system around, I think it was around 2008. And it was a dual Xeon system that I was running some RME and Lynx cards on down to 32 samples. And I was doing, massive testing and scaling and multiprocessor testing on this machine. It was a dual quad, so it was an 8-core. So back in, it was around 2007, I think it was. And I got a call from one of my close friends and colleagues that said, look, we've been reading what you're doing. Do you mind if we come and grab this Xeon off you? This is one of my close friends that was working for Digidesign at the time. I said, yep. So they were actually paying attention. And yes, you could run the thing down to 32 samples. Yes, you can run a whole stack of audio. The balancing act is how much DSP can you run at those 32 samples? Yeah, and then that's that crossover point. You need to start raising the buffers to actually get more DSP. But people were shuffling between the lower buffer when they're tracking and stuff, and the higher buffer when they were mixing. So, but this is what the hardware DSP actually eliminated. You didn't need to be able to. You didn't need to do that. Because you weren't shuffling between needing to low latency monitoring and balancing your DSP processing, because the actual chips were actually managing at least a portion of that. Yeah.
Yeah. And now we have things at AVID where have a hybrid engine where you can have low latency paths and higher buffer signal paths concurrently, with just as long as they're all synchronized properly and it actually works out great. So there's a lot of different ways to skin that cat.
Yes. If we can just cover that noughties period really quickly, because that was a period that led up to that major transition to when you opened the platform up. So it was, between, so it was that Pro Tools 5, and then I had a bit of a chuckle that you guys introduced surround sound at Pro Tools 5.1.
Yeah. Let's go over that. So you may have noticed I'm being semi-insistent on mentioning a few names. I'm going to mention a few more as we get into this zone here because they need to be acknowledged.
Sure.
I'm going to do a quick shout out to Toby Dunn, who's hired in '92. And he was in the master's program at the University of Miami, and he was one of these early developers of our sound accelerator card and had one of the first ones. I think he might have even had the monophonic one. Anyways, he did research on digital noise reduction. And as we know, Sonic Solutions was a major pioneer of that at another company.
Of course.
But so I think it got everybody's interest of, there's this technique where you can put audio into the frequency domain, and then you can do manipulations there and find out that certain frequency bins are below a certain threshold, and therefore they can be zeroed out, and you can still, keep the music while getting rid of the noise.
Yep.
So Toby was such a major player he stuck around. He was hired in 92. He stayed around until 2013.
Yep.
Major guy in AX development, TI chip transitions, designing FPGAs to get TDM to go up to 768 channels, I guess it was at that time. And of course, we're above that now. And also he was a lead engineer on the 11 product. So I know I'm jumping back and forth in time, but he was right in the thick of things there in that sort of early to mid 90s timeframe. And I'm going to mention one other person. Paul Nyrink was a guy that came in as somebody that had real digital audio experience and came from Orban. And he was the guy that figured out, there's these textbooks on digital signal processing. They all said, well, to design a digital EQ, you need to use the bilinear transform. And everybody sort of believed the textbook. And he sort of figured out that the common knowledge was actually incorrect, and that the frequency response in the digital domain was different than it was in the analog domain. And it was the interaction between sample rates and the frequency response of digital filters, and really dialed that thing in. And so he was a bit of a rock star for us in that time period. And I'm going to give one last shout out here to Mike Rockwell, who is kind of a higher up at Apple now, doing augmented reality and virtual reality stuff, and had great success at Dolby as well, and had a pretty good career. But in the early 90s, he was a beta tester for Pro Tools, and he was in LA, he was in recording studios, and he kind of saw how Pro Tools was being used by a lot of people in post-production. And so he developed on his own a couple of applications, one that was called Track Transfer, which was the ability to merge Pro Tools sessions together. And this, again, is him just entirely as a third-party developer, which was really important because at that time in LA and other parts of the world, there might be one sound designer or sound engineer working on the Foley for a film, and another one doing the sound effects, and another one doing the dialogue. And all of those things actually needed to be played out of a single Pro Tools session. I mean, eventually we got satellite link and other ways of solving that problem. But, he saw the need for something and created it himself. And he also did something called Session Lister, which was a way for the mixers on soundstage to basically visualize where cues were coming up that were in a Pro Tools session.
Right.
So Digidesign, and I guess with Peter Gotcher, probably Paul Lego, say, let's hire this guy. He comes up from a meeting, I think, to say, I want to distribute I want to distribute my product with your product. And they're like, how about we just hire you? So, so he was very, very involved. And he was, although a talented coder, was definitely had the chops for being a manager. And he actually kind of struggled with doing both because he's good at both of them. Mm-hmm. And, but eventually, I guess actually in talking to him, I did my homework this last week. He said his the best thing he did for Digidesign was hiring a guy named Dave Conry. And so Dave was the guy that, going back now from Pro Tools, you're talking about Pro Tools 5. So I was long-winded there, but there is a method to my madness here. Pro Tools 4 was our conversion. So I wrote Pro Tools initially in a programming language called Object Pascal.
Right.
So object-oriented programming was a new thing back in the early 90s. And it's a great thing, and we all do it now. And how could we have ever done it any other way than that? But it was a new thing in the 90s.
Was that with Delphi or something totally separate?
So we were using, Mac app, right?
All right. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, for on the Mac side. And of course, this is, we get into this is right around the time that we actually port Pro Tools from the Macintosh platform to the, to be cross-platform, to run on Windows. And there were two different approaches. One was, let's rewrite it from scratch. And the other one was, well, there's somebody that has a tool that'll just kind of automate this process for us. And the proponents of let's rewrite it were, of course, this is the architecturally, we could be better. You could, as software designers, you're always like, look back at your old code and go, with like, oh, what was I thinking? And, it could be architecturally.
And the other person that came before you is always the worst developer in the whole world. So, yeah.
Of course. Yeah. But some of it is like, if you're small, if you design your first home, well, it just needs one bedroom and a bathroom and a kitchen, right? And you're like one human being or something, or maybe you're a couple. And then eventually your family grows and you add on and you keep building. And of course, the village or the town or the metropolis that you end up with is never, if like you knew you were going to end up with a metropolis, of course you're going to design it completely differently than adding on to your little cottage. So that's true of our, the software development we did in Pro Tools. So there was a faction that was like, let's really re-architect this thing. And they started re-architecting, and they went on with their way re-architecting, and it's like 9 months later. And meanwhile, there's this other person using the tool. He's got the whole thing working, right? And the people re-architecting still don't have anything really working. I mean, it's beautiful code. Oh my God, it's glorious. Yeah. Look at that code. It's sparkly, but we can't play back audio yet. So anyways, so that kind of happened. So anyways, Dave Connery, right. So he is instrumental in, he's actually, when Mike Rockwell becomes a manager, I think he's the first person that Mike hires. And I actually completely forgot what Dave's background was, but he was somebody had, knew his way around a computer and programming one and set forward. And so we did this whole transition also of going from Object Pascal to, probably Code Warrior was probably your dev tool. And it was C++, which was, the writing was on the wall. Everybody's writing code in C++. And, there wasn't going to be much support for Object Pascal any longer. I think probably Apple had more or less given up on, writing their APIs with Object Pascal. So, anyway, so Dave's contribution is tremendous, so we do rewrite a lot of things. Actually, I'm going to look at my notes here because I want to remember this stuff here. So this is the port of to C++, and then also playlists. So previously a track was a track and you had audio on a track and that was simple as that. And the whole thing of breaking apart playlists and to have multiple playlists available on a track, it was, a huge sort of architectural undertaking. And then also to really open up our system so that all plugins could be automatable and really make those things show up and be much more than static effects just on a track. And then things like as we get into Pro Tools 4, 4.1.2 is the time of control surfaces. Yeah. So I think the very first ones were things like J.L. Cooper or Penny and Giles, but then the Mackie Huey comes along, and then eventually we should have been first with our Pro Control, but we had a lot of trouble making that work because it was a very ambitious control surface, basically, and it had a lot of cool stuff that we were trying to do to it. So we didn't really get Pro Control out until Pro Tools 4.2, and Dave Connery's involved in that. And then we get around to surround audio, right? So big deal there. So now we've, previously Pro Tools was only mono tracks, like mono it was AAF files or WAV files. I mean, I guess the WAV files were probably later.
Yeah, and the stereo was always dual. Yeah, it was dual mono. Dual mono. It was never a stereo track.
Because it was, simple for us engineers to go, all tracks could just be mono, and that makes things easier. We don't have to deal with interleaved audio. And then eventually it's like, no, actually you do need to deal with interleaved audio. In fact, you need to deal with it in a big way because 5.1 audio is starting to become a major thing. And so we need to not only play those files back that are being rendered, but we should, of course, author them as well. So the whole rethink of our I/O and rethink of what could be passing through. I mean, really, that's more of a disk manager thing of reading files off of disk that are interleaved. Clearly, all the signals inside of Pro Tools are kind of quote unquote mono, right? They're all just single individual streams at that point. And then we also had a first attempt at cloud-based collaboration with the Rocket Networks integration. That was Pro Tools 5.2.
Right.
So a lot of exciting things happening there. And at this point, I mean, I haven't really been talking about me. I have, really got the thing going with Pro Tools 1, Pro Tools 2, Pro Tools 3 was all my code. And, that's not to say that we didn't have a DAE that was doing all the inner workings, and that was Pete Rickard and Doug Tissier. Mm-hmm. Pro Tools 4, we're starting to become a pretty successful company, and we have a lot of, again, all this stuff with control surfaces, et cetera. So the team greatly expands. And so along the way, we have Doug Tissier, we have Dave Connery contributing, and I'm sure other people that I'm going to forget to give credit to right now. And so that takes us up, I don't know, what year would that be? Pro Tools 5.2, what are we talking about?
I'm looking. Around 5.1 was 2001. So it'd probably around 2002, I would say. Yeah.
So I'm going to mention now a name, and you should really do a third interview of the evolution of Pro Tools with Paul Virtualotti.
Right.
And the reason I'm handpicking Paul Virtualotti is that he's still with AVID now, and he's our main architect. So I guess I was going to sort of mention, well, what am I doing in all the midst of this? And it's like a lot of little things. I was the person who conceived of Beat Detective. So I would take that on. I'd be like, actually, there's a little interesting story. There's a guy, Scott Humphrey, who was doing editing on a major heavy metal band's album. And maybe the word metal appears in the name of that band. And anyway, and he is reporting to me that he has Pro Tools sessions that take like 30 minutes to open. And I'm like, that's preposterous. What's wrong? There's a bug here. And then I'm like, well, what are you doing? And he kind of explains. And he said, yeah, this session has, 30,000 edits in it. Wow. 30,000. What are you talking? What are you doing?
I know where this is headed.
All right, he's doing. Yeah. All right. Well, I guess it's sort of obvious that there was maybe some drum editing done on some.
Just some slight timing adjustments.
Yeah. Well, actually, it may or may not have been timing. Maybe it was, but it actually had a lot to do with, as we all know, is that if you want just your face to be hammered off on playback, you merge samples in with the human performance, right?
Yes.
You do this time alignment thing.
Yes.
And if you're going to do time alignment, well, you need an edit point to do a time alignment, maybe at least at that point. So Scott Humphrey, a major inspirer and motivator to create something like Beat Detective. And so I would do that. So then there's also later on, actually this is kind of, I guess, appropriate. When we came out with AAX, and I realize I'm jumping ahead again, but oh well, we said, all right, we're going to have now these cards that have amazing DSP power. There's sort of a message to all the engineering group. What can we do to use those DSPs? What signal processing algorithms have not been invented yet that would be real DSP hogs so that we can justify people spending money on this stuff? And I thought about it, and I thought about it some more. And I said, well, I don't really know the answer to that question, but I know something that would make the host work harder. And if the host is working harder, then by inference, the DSPs are going to be needed more to do your reverbs and your dynamics processing and your EQs and whatnot, because your host is going to be so busy doing elastic audio.
Yep.
So that would be another thing that while I did work on some of the time stretch algorithms, but I was maybe working more on the high level part of it rather than the low level disk scheduling part of Elastic Audio. And actually, Paul Vercelati would get much of the credit there. And that's why you should interview that guy. So then also the plugins, the DeFi plugin suite, with the exception of Verify that Doug Tissier wrote. But I wrote the Lo-Fi and the Sci-Fi and the Rectify, and I wrote Maxim, and I wrote a couple of cross-synthesis plugins that people, I'm very proud of, actually. I think they were great, even if they're probably not very well known. But there's one called Bruno.
Yes.
And Rezo.
Yes, I know them.
One was kind of Resonator Bank, and I thought there's some cool sounds out of that. And really, Bruno was more like granular. It was a granular synthesizer is really what it was, although we didn't call it that, but that's in fact what it was. So I always took on, again, this sort of thing of liking to be creative with the projects that I took on. So I would be doing things like that throughout, I guess, the later 90s into the 2000s. So where do we want to take it from here?
Well, I think if we can get to that transition point, all right? So within the noughties, AVID, no, they were still Digidesign then. So Digidesign, you acquired...
yeah, the merger was early, right? So the merger was 95, I think. But, we were a successful digital audio brand in the name of Digidesign, and why not keep that? And, there's always marketing considerations here. And if you look at a company like Roland, well, they have their Boss line and their Roland line. Or if you look at what is Lexus is actually... Toyota, yeah. So there's always a good marketing reason to differentiate, and there's also very good marketing reason to integrate, right? And I think at some point, AVID, very wisely said, we want to be the solution for in post-production, and we want to present ourselves as AVID, as AVID has audio and video, because that's what people are doing. So that happened later, right? But we were known as Digidesign for, through the aughts.
Yeah, and 2010 was actually the change. So,
Correct.
The point I was just trying to make just previously was that during those noughties, Digidesign acquired M Audio, and then you were implementing that technology in two ways. One was you came up with Pro Tools M-powered, so you were still locking the software to very specific hardware.
Yes,
and also the things like Mbox 3 and Mbox 3 Pro. They were, well, I mean, I've done a lot of work with audio drivers and recognizing fingerprints, and I knew that they were based on, the Firewire one was based on a dice. So there was some crossover there with the M Audio technology that you guys acquired and those M boxes. And that was an interesting period because that was through Cubase, Pro Tools. That was through Pro Tools 7. 8, and then there was the shift at 9, and that's where I think we should kind of discuss that, because that was a very significant shift away from, always being predominantly locked to very specific hardware. And I remember the dynamic that changed when Pro Tools 9 came out. It was quite incredible that the level of new users that attracted. And that was just that simple change where you opened the kimono just a little bit, right, and allowed ASIO and Core Audio. So can you remember much about that period of time?
It's a period that is more of a pivot in terms of marketing rather than something that would be significant to me as a software developer.
Right. Okay. So
I don't think I can really add much value on that topic, although I absolutely remember it. I remember the discussions, and it was maybe hotly contested or something, that there were people that had feelings on both sides of it. And again, it was really about the business.
Right.
Like, what's better for the business?
Yes.
And it's, the world was becoming open, the idea of open source software and so forth. Like the whole thing of, And I think it also had to do with the quantity, the quantity of interfaces that were out there. And that, when we started, there wasn't many choices. And we were kind of like, we knew we'd work with our choice, which was one of the few that we developed it. And I think that it became that, things like plug and play MIDI interfaces that were class compliant. I mean, like, how can, it's just so easy. And there's just no good reason for us to not support that other than, being somehow money grubbing and say, no, we insist that you buy our hardware at its potentially inflated price. I think that, that didn't feel good. It didn't make sense. And we didn't want to do that anymore. So, but again, this is something that wasn't really engineering driven. And so being that my lens is coming from that engineering side, I certainly can't claim to be an authority on any of this.
Right. So, I mean, my question would be that when you did that initial shift to allow ASIO and core audio, at that software engineering level, that would have introduced some new areas for the code, or was it pretty much in place and you just,
Yeah, it wasn't a major shift technologically.
Right.
I think, the way that the driver hooked into the engine, and it was, not code I wrote, but I don't think it was code that was particularly that hard to write either.
Right. Okay. So that was always a question for me. That how much of a job was it to actually get that ASIO and core audio implementation?
I guess I shouldn't. No, you know what? Now that I said, both of those things are a little tricky, so I should not trivialize them. They are tricky to get just right, so that you have consistency, and that's something I could do research on to point you in the right direction for somebody that was more directly involved in it than I was.
That's okay. I mean, that was just a off the top of my head question.
Yeah, and that's a good question.
Yeah.
It's a good question. It is important because it did to the end users. It was a major shift.
Yeah, and look, I could already see some cracks opening there. Not cracks, but there was there's definitely. We'll say there was a crack of sunlight there when the M Audio acquisition came about, because those M Audio interfaces and the MBox 3 range also had ASIO drivers, and they had good ASIO drivers. So the only software that was not talking to that ASIO driver, even on your own interfaces, was Pro Tools up until version 8. So I went, how far away is the transition? And there I was at Pro Tools 9. So I was actually part of the beta. I was part of the beta team at Pro Tools 8, and I can tell you we were completely oblivious that Pro Tools 9 was even in development. And then all of a sudden it landed, and I'm like going, hang on.
I feel that way too, right? That between 8 and 9 and 10 and 11 seemed like and maybe they didn't, but they seemed like they, because we would hang on to Pro Tools 5 for a long time, or Pro Tools 6 for a long time, Pro Tools 7 for a long time. And then it seemed like we kind of jumped. And I think there was reasons for that, because some of it had to do with, we had to rewrite the file format for the Pro Tools session because of, some major things having to do with, maybe interleaved audio, or the, more importantly, our I/O setup, right, of how audio paths exist in Pro Tools, where the old session format just would not really accommodate a whole new way of structuring the data.
There was also a point where you went from fixed point to floating point as well, which
precisely.
I think that was Pro Tools 11, somewhere around there.
Yeah, I mean, that should have been with AAX in the TI process, because the TI processor is a floating point processor. And, floating point is just kind of a good way to go anyways.
Yeah. But I remember that was a significant shift as well. So
sure.
And then there was also that transition, because you had people with the older DSP cards that were not capable of a floating point, and then if you had a session that was utilizing the floating point processing, and then you couldn't actually open it in an earlier Pro Tools session if you're using the earlier DSP cards. And
sure.
I still remember that there was definitely some crossover there. That
and that's another example of 20/20 hindsight. Like the fact that, for example, the old session format, we only had 6 dB of positive gain on a fader. Like really stupid but we used probably the largest 32-bit integer to represent plus 6 dB. And it's like, okay, well, we either need more than 32 bits, which is maybe what we ended up doing internally. But there's things like that where like, oh, the old sessions couldn't get any louder than plus 6 dB on any given track.
Yeah.
So, and it's like, oh, why didn't we think of this better when we initially came up with however we're going to represent our data? Like sometimes, you just aren't really thinking ahead the way you should.
Yeah. And look, what was really interesting, if you in talking to I'll call them the old school Pro Tools guys that were very entrenched in that dynamic, that the gain structures for them, 0 was 0 was 0. You don't go near it. Where for those of us that were using other DAWs with floating point engines, we're like 0. If we pushed it a little bit hot, you weren't getting this huge, crunch there.
Yeah, so, there's of course the question of how much actual headroom you have in your digital signal to begin with. But if you've recorded something that the peak is 18 dB down, well, you can easily have 18 dB without clipping that thing. And the thing is, well, hold on, why not go? I mean, the thing is, you have a summing mixer, you have a bunch of things down the line. So that's the beauty of floating point, right? Is things can be clipped. I'm not really clipped, but actually above unity gain or above 0 dB, like massively throughout your signal path. And as long as you can pull down that signal to be, within your safe range by the time it gets printed into a WAV file or whatever, then you're good. And I mean, that's all of those limitations and those, those are big challenges that we had with our signal path, from the get-go of doing this right. Because the other thing is you don't want to attenuate a signal. You don't want to have tons of headroom to the fact that you're losing bits on the low end either. And then you have, a 12-bit signal that you're amplifying up to make a 16-bit WAV file. This is, of course, going backwards in time when such things were the mainstay.
Yep.
So, it's been a fascinating journey, and I still like doing it. I've been on different teams. Like in recent years, I was on a team that was very video focused, and the whole thing of really Atmos, like a bunch of the Atmos, without getting too specific on what Atmos features are, there's things called Atmos groups and things like that. And so, or we did a implementation where we made our video engine where frame rate and raster and were independent of each other. Because in the past, you'd always had things, well, PAL is this, and there's various, NTSC is this other thing. There's these video standards, and to really decouple basically the size of your image and your frame rate and a few other things was a transition for our video engine. And then I did the basically the user-facing portion of that to allow the user to select what resolution-independent parameters they wanted to work on.
Yeah.
But anyways, I guess I bring that up as another example of how, formats can change and you need to kind of extend, how your session file works.
Yeah.
And we actually have a pretty good system now where we can add things, and we basically have a mechanism where things can be added on without breaking the old way of doing things.
Yeah.
We're much more mindful of that. Whereas at the beginning, we left no room for ourselves to be smart about doing such things.
Yeah. Well, look, and with the video aspect of it, a lot of people, unless you're working with video, may not realize that there are completely different formats, regional formats, and it's to do, and it's to do with the different voltages and all of that type of stuff. And then it's way above pay grade, but I do understand that we've got.
Well, we're now in an era where people make videos with their phone that has a variable frame rate. So it's not even like you have one frame rate anymore. Oh, this frame is this long and the next frame is shorter, probably because you went from a light room to a dark room or something. I don't know what exactly drives that, or maybe it's motion, the amount of data that changes within an individual frame. But and so you really have to have a very versatile video engine to handle all this stuff. And also, completely non-standard frame rates. So it used to be, you had your 29.7 and your 30 and your 50 and your 25.
And there's one in 24. I can't remember exactly which one.
Yeah, there is one. And it's sort of a pulled down. Yeah, that's kind of a weird one because it's sort of like, well, it should be 25, but because some Americans touched that video, it got screwed up, and now it's at 24.768 or something like that.
Yeah, and it has to do with the voltages, and I thought it had something to do with the voltages.
Well, the hertz. I mean, we're a 60 hertz world here in the United States, and it's a 50 hertz world in Europe, and in Australia, I'm assuming 50, maybe.
29.97 is our. What's that one?
Oh, well, that's the American. That's based off of the United States. I mean,
I might have it back to front. We are different to the US. So what's the US 50? Is the US 50?
No, you're all wrong. We're going.
So hang on. The US is 60.
No, but you were right. You started off doing great. We have a 60 hertz alternating current in our walls here in the United States. In Europe and UK and so forth, it's 50 hertz.
I'd say we're on that because
I would imagine, you have a strong connection to
we're
England,
also 240 volt as well, where Europe is 230. Yes. You guys are 110.
But it's the frequency that really makes a big difference here.
But I can't imagine. I think it's crazy, but I guess that's the origin of it, is that they based the frame rates off of the alternating current, which is like not a reliable sort of clock, but I guess it was good enough.
I remember the old, like the European version of the Commodore 64, the games would run, I think, slightly slower than the ones in the US because everything was based off that current speed.
Right.
I guess, I find that crazy, but it completely makes sense. I mean, the reason I find it crazy is because Crystal, like these other higher frequency clocks, have been around for a long time. A long time meaning since I've been involved in technology. But in any case, the whole 2997 that's a story unto itself. But originally, black and white TV was 30 frames a second. And then they're like, well, where do we put the color information? And the answer was, well, if we slow down 30 just a bit, we can squeeze in this color information into our broadcast signal somehow. And the old TVs, the black and white TVs, will still work. Like they won't be completely haywire because it's close enough to 30 that they'll manage. And then these color TVs can take that little extra bit of data. And of course, it's all analog. So I say data. I don't really know exactly how it was encoded, but in any case, crazy technology.
Yeah. If I may, I just quickly on Atmos, that's a really interesting area of discussion for me and Pete, because we started some dialogue, and I'm trying to remember, Pete, was it about 18 months ago?
Probably about that.
About 18 months ago, I had some good clients of mine saying, hey, Vin, what's with Dolby Atmos on Windows? Because there's not a lot on offer. They had their own dedicated type of processing software. There wasn't a lot of implementation in the DAWs, and he was starting to get some inquiry from some clients saying, hey, can you do a music mix in Atmos? And 18 months ago, we're going, what? Music mix in Atmos? And I remember I approached Pete, and we made some preliminary inquiries with Dolby, why there wasn't as much of a presence, and it was almost like a chicken and egg type of discussion. I'll just leave it at that. It was very much a chicken and egg, and in the fact that if there isn't a call for it, we're not going to be putting too much focus on it. And then within a couple of months, we had Nuendo come out with Atmos.
You know, that's interesting you say that, because I believe that Dolby put a lot behind making sure that Atmos got out there. And it wasn't so much of, I mean, they were like, because I don't know that actually the world is craving this surround music experience. And this is coming from an individual. I have tons of DVD audio discs because I love listening in surround. So I want it. But I don't know, just if you look back at the first launch of surround audio with 5.1, where a lot of classic albums got remixed for surround. And around that same time, MP3 players and just, you know, the general file sharing or whatever was also happening. That was the early 2000s. And guess which one won? People chose convenience over, you know, sort of the ultimate listening experience.
Yeah.
And so maybe I'm slightly jaded because of that, but it's my perception that people don't really want to have this exquisite, immersive audio experience with music. They just want to tap their toes and sing along with the, you know, whatever. But that's maybe not the point. The point is that Dolby has been very, very much promoting, making sure that we were on board with supporting Atmos in Pro Tools.
Yes.
But the initial, yes.
And I'm gonna here's the but. Mac only. That Atmos plugin was not on Windows. So this was the not a point. I will say a point of contention for me was that. Well, hang on. There's a Pro Tools Atmos add-on, but it's Mac only. So this was the original premise of why we thought, hang on, we should kind of see if we can open some inquiry with Dolby and why there is less of a presence on Windows. So, and just quickly, it changed. You know, that landscape over the next 6 months changed almost immediately after the conversation. I don't think it had anything to do with our conversation, but Nuendo came out with Atmos. DaVinci Resolve came out with Atmos. So it wasn't like it couldn't have been a massive licensing issue or anything like that. It's just we weren't quite sure why. But now I think when Apple, and this is an interesting point, right? So when Apple came out with, I can't remember what they call it, but they says it's Atmos compatible. It's not quite Atmos. And then I've just read an article that, you know, there's definitely some gray area of how they've actually implemented that Atmos.
Well, there's the thing about Atmos is the delivery of audio into, I mean, the initial concept, right, is let's not do these standards anymore of taking 5.1 to 7.1 to the next thing. And frankly, there's going to be in big metropolitan areas, these ultimate theaters that'll have 132 speakers, and then down the road a bit will be a maybe more modest version of that. And we can't simply have some massive standard that we expect everybody to comply to. And it's always been the way it is with movie theaters. Every movie theater has been, a little better or a little worse than the next one in terms of how they did their installed audio.
Yeah.
So, but also the other beauty of Atmos is, well, really, if we have this hummingbird that's flying through the Amazon, it's really one sound source that is an object. We're going to call it an object in Atmos parlance, that is moving around somewhere in the picture, and we want to track that and then have that basically be delivered as best possible to whatever speaker installation there is in your listening environment. So let's kind of decouple the audio from the speakers, which was I guess you could call that a revolutionary idea for Dolby to do that. So I've lost our thread though now. What was the question?
well, yeah. It's more so Atmos for music, because that was.
Oh yeah. So back, right. Yes, thank you for getting me back in track. So now, what does Apple do? Well, Apple's like, we sell these we don't sell multi-speaker configuration. We sell earbuds.
Correct.
And so, how can we create a seemingly immersive surrounding audio experience with a pair of earbuds. So let's now do this additional work to create perception. Let's figure out phase, whatever the trickery is that allows a listener to perceive something to be in front of them rather than behind them, which is a very tricky thing. And it has a lot to do with the shape of our earlobes. And I actually believe that we train ourselves in infancy to figure out how to do this. That when our mother has our bottle and she's behind us and we hear the door creak open and there's something happens and our brain learns that, oh, that was behind me. So so Apple has, in conjunction with Dolby, figured out some algorithmic stuff to deliver perceptual mixes with just two earbuds or two, headphones or whatever you're listening with.
So it's not quite Atmos, is it?
Well, it's Atmos Plus because they've done an Atmos mix, because I guarantee you the person mixing those mixes is actually required to have, there's a very specific spec, and I know this from my friend Ed Stasium, who is going to do some mixes in Atmos, and Reiner Warner, I guess the record label, said, here's what you need to get in order to do your mix, in order for it to be compliant to Dolby. So the audio is mixed with lots and lots of speakers. And then there's going to be some kind of encoding process that takes all of those discrete audio channels and does something to them so that the speaker that is supposedly behind you and above you on the left side, that you will perceive the audio coming from there, even with those little earbuds in your ears. And yes, I'm forgetting the name of it too. It's okay. I got a search engine here.
Yeah, a quick search. Now, so look, interestingly now, I think it is starting to take off because, Cubase has actually just introduced Atmos. So it's come out of the, the post-only type of area.
Well, it's important for the DAWs to do it if they want their DAW to be used in post-production on any kind of a feature film or not feature film, then you need to support these features. But
this is my point. Steinberg have Nuendo, which is their more post-focused application, which is basically Cubase on steroids with some additional post-only features.
Yeah, I get your point. Is that if they're doing it on their music creation app,
correct? Then
maybe. So it's called spatial audio.
There you go. That's the one.
Spatial audio.
Spatial audio.
Well, if music consumers on this planet have evolved from where they were 20 years ago when sort of that version of spatial audio was delivered to the world and people are largely indifferent to it, fantastic, because I'm a fan.
Yeah.
I love this stuff.
Well, it's nice if we start moving the kids away from compressed MP3 being the norm and back into something that's a little bit higher quality and immersive.
You're saying this while I think about all of the popular music that is intentionally lo-fi, like intentionally kind of screwed up in some way that doesn't actually require, a amazing sound system to replicate. Because ultimately, let's be real. I mean, the music is emotional. I mean, people want an emotional response from music, largely, except for the real egghead people that I'm one of those also. But and so the thing is that if there's a musical expression really does not require high fidelity or spatial audio to impart emotion, on people. And as long as that's true, and I grew up with my first introduction, because I'm this old, I'm actually 60 years old this year, is that, my first music was on an AM radio, and that didn't sound good, but I still enjoyed listening to music on an AM radio.
And Mark, I'm not that far off your age, mate. I'm around the same age. Listening to mono AM radio in my bed early in the morning, quietly before the household woke up, and so I'm there with you.
Okay.
It's weird to be the young guy in the room. I turn 50 next week.
Okay. Boy, happy birthday. Well, I'll make sure that I'll give you a big happy birthday, the big 50.
My AARP card showed up in the mail. I was like, oh no. It's Mark. It's funny that you mentioned spatial audio because the place where that really comes into play for us is games and VR.
Oh, of course. Of course.
It's not music consumption. It's about like placements of objects in space when you're wearing like a headset or something like that.
Absolutely. Oh yeah, that's great, and maybe that is the killer app for all of this. But if other DAWs, if people are really digging spatial audio for just music delivery, again, I'm being redundant here, but I think that's fantastic. And if you're seeing a trend, Vin, that more and more DAWs are picking up on that feature set because they think it's important for music mixing, then that's better evidence than I have.
Yeah.
Vin, is it fair to say that it's less about music listening and more about things like Netflix and other stuff and the music formats they require for their mixes? Or
I think it's a bit of a cross, Pete. Yeah. The initial inquiry was music for Netflix, and it's good that you bring up Netflix, because Netflix was the one that was making the point to their music content creators, saying if you want to write music for this particular series or film or whatever else, you need to deliver an Atmos mix. So they were the first, but then it shifted to music away from film and TV, and that was the Apple spatial audio thing, But I read an interesting article this week, and I sent you that link, Pete. It's not all wine and roses there. So interesting, and I can't remember the detail enough to kind of go into a finer detail there. But there is some stuff that Apple have done that is left of center of like a pure Atmos type of mix. So the point that the author was making was that if you have an Atmos mix, don't expect it to sound the same when Apple play it back through their algorithm. So that was the whole point of the article. I might send that one to you as well, Mark, because it was I'm very interested. It was an interesting article. I think moving on, I did have a point where I said, overview of AVID's breadth of development in hardware and software, and how integral that was. But we've already covered that, I think. So I think what we should do is let's fast forward to the present, all right? Because the challenges that a lot of, and I hate using the word challenge, but I mean, I can't think of a better word at the moment, but the challenge that all of the DAW manufacturers have, especially when they're leaning more on the native side of stuff, and this is what you guys are doing with Carbon and the hybrid, the new hybrid stuff, is that then we start dealing with multi-core and multi-processing and low latency performance and or cross-platform performance. And then there's specific optimizations on Windows that may or may not have caused the problem. And I'm going to do Pete a favor, and I'm not going to actually mention the M word, because that's basically my kryptonite. But there was certain optimizations within Windows that some DAWs leaned on a lot more heavily and were heavily impacted with when the threading was limited. I have not seen that in Pro Tools, so I'm not going to bring it up because I don't think it's impacted you guys at all. So
okay,
but it'd been good to kind of get just some feedback from you where you think that whole multi-core and native processing is heading for you guys, because like I mentioned, with Carbon, you guys are focusing more and more on the native processing. You've still got DSP for I/O and some plug-in, but you're definitely leaning more towards the native horsepower. And this is something that you guys were. Well, it's not new because you had HD native as well back in the. Was it early noughties? No, in the early 10s, you went to HD native as well. So it's not like it's a new approach, but Carbon is a little bit different. Do you have any detail on what that DSP and hybrid approach is? Can you detail that for us a little bit? Because I think that'll be interesting.
It would be very interesting. And I think I want to propose to you that you do a part 3 with Paul Verschelati.
Okay.
Because I will tell you that my current focus is on music creation, and I can't be more specific than that, but working on new things. And it's really very end user focused features as opposed to engine work. So I guess I'd leave it at that. But I think you've characterized what we've done thus far. But I think to speak with any real authority on the topic, I'd be an imposter if I did that.
Okay. So no, that's cool. And look, and thank you for your honesty on that one. So I didn't want to kind of press you into areas that you weren't comfortable with. So thank you for that. And but I do want to make one point about Carbon was the protocol that AVID decided to use, which was oh God, now my brain's gone blank. What's that network protocol, Pete? Not Dante. What's the other one? AVB.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I found it interesting that AVID chose the AVB platform for Carbon, and the reason I say that again because my perspective is always coming from the Windows side, and AVB is not native on Windows, and Carbon is still not released on that Windows platform. Now I was approached very early on to see whether I had any interest in perhaps helping on that side of the things, and I've went, yep, this is a while back now. I haven't heard anything since.
I think you have the potential of becoming AVID's new best friend because
Really?
yeah, because this is what can I say? It is usually the case, and it can go either way, but it is if you look at the platforms, they're usually not equal in some area, and it's going to be the path of least resistance to pursue AVB on the Apple platform. And so that will be, and it's pretty hard. I mean, in a perfect world, we would have complete parity across platform with technology.
Yep.
And the reality is like, well, this is good to go. We still haven't developed our Windows solution yet, but we can at least satisfy part of the marketplace by making this available on Apple. And we're going to include that in, Pro Tools 2022 version 1.
Yeah. So, but it was interesting because of the two protocols, there was AVB and there was Dante, and it's almost the VHS versus beta type of argument.
It totally is that, yeah. And the thing is that when I say like you could be advocate, because I think that having somebody, because you are a unique individual, there's not a lot of VINs out there really kind of pushing the envelope the way that you have. Since I guess maybe your listeners know about your story, but you're just always kind of the guy to try something first on it with a new technology on the Windows platform, and I think having somebody like you being more involved in the discussions at AVID would only be beneficial.
Yeah. Well, look, I don't have that close connection. I used to have some very, very close connections at AVID, but those people have actually moved on.
That's my implication here is that we'll let's try to change that.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. That'll be fantastic.
Yeah, my vote, Vin.
Okay. Thanks, mate. Thanks, mate. Hey, just real quickly, because we're kind of getting towards the end of the tether now. Can I ask you, Mark, your views on how your initial vision for Pro Tools became pretty much the industry standard for a very long time, and arguably it still is in post-production. I mean, people will, may kind of skirt that, but in post-production, it's still a Pro Tools world. I don't care what if the Nuendo listeners are listening in and getting their nose out of joint. I'm sorry, Nuendo users. I was a very high-level Nuendo solutions provider for many, many years, and I know who won that battle in the post world, and so it still is a very much an industry standard. But Pro Tools became almost synonymous with a digital audio recording, So, you could, and I mentioned this to Evan, where I would, if you say to someone, well, people ask, well, what do you do, Vin? I'm going, well, I'm a DAW solutions provider. They're going, what's that? And I'm going, digital audio workstation. They're going, well, what's that? I've gone, Pro Tools. They're going, oh. If I said Cubase, Nuendo, Studio One, they wouldn't have any idea what I was talking about. But because I said Pro Tools, then they had at least a conceptual idea of what it was. And that whole industry standard thing, that was that was a marketing point for you guys for quite a while. So do you have, any thoughts on, because you fathered this thing.
Yeah.
This was your baby,
It was, indeed. Well, I would say this. At the time that Pro Tools was launched in the early 90s, the recording studio, which was, sort of the center of the bullseye of what we were trying to create a solution for. And granted, I'll say that, of course, we didn't have the 24-track version of Pro Tools, not for a long time. So it was sort of, but it was going to be the thing that was in the side of the control room, and it had very specific certain tasks that it would perform well at. But what I'm really trying to say here is that we were thinking about the recording engineer and the recording studio, and a lot of course, the genetics of Pro Tools in terms of having channel strips and faders and tracks and all of those things was based upon a paradigm that existed before Pro Tools. Now, I'm an individual that likes to think a bit outside the box, but I knew that it was very obvious that we needed to be a bit more inside the box with what was going to be offered in Pro Tools. And even though you can say, well, no, but Pro Tools was revolutionary and it did all these things that you couldn't do with tape, but still, I think the orientation of the application was that. Now, if you look at Ableton Live or, many other things that are, or even Logic Audio for that matter, they're much more oriented towards the music creator than the recording engineer. So that, has created opportunity and challenges for us. The opportunity was it was familiar. A recording engineer could look at Pro Tools and go, okay, I get it. I see the same thing. Oh, there's inserts, there's buses. I can create returns. I can do all of the signal flow stuff that I'm doing with this analog gear and do it with this other gear. I would say that, my perspective is I have regret that we kind of, we cling to things that work maybe for longer than we should. And that we could have, there was a lot of ideas of things that, were more like Ableton or more just things that were a bit too far outside of the comfort zone. And, so I think, that would be my commentary, is simply that I wish that we were a bit more accepting of risk and taking chances. But mature companies that need to satisfy shareholders and stuff like that are probably not, it's not kind of a bit of a taboo thing.
Yeah.
But I am totally proud of, I'd love it when I read an interview that is, one of my favorite music artists, and they mention Pro Tools, and I'm like, fantastic. I'm so honored to have played this very small role that is completely unknown, right? To the artist, doesn't know who I am, but I feel like, okay, some of my creativity or my productivity was somehow in the midst of somebody creating some great art. And that's fantastic.
Yeah, I don't think it's a small contribution, Mark. And
right.
I made the comment in our pre-chat, because we had a long pre-chat, which was awesome, by the way. And I made the comment that when I was doing my research, and I loved the refresher, because I'm going, I remember that, and I barely saw your name mentioned in these, what we call them, the historical documents. And I thought that I'm actually going to put some effort in actually changing that, because I think that your initial efforts should be wider known to the majority of Pro Tools users, whether they're young or old. There would be a lot of people, even back in that have been with you since version 1 that may not even have heard your name. And I found that was a bit. What's the word? I actually wanted to change that so that more.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, more people actually knew that you were the father of Pro Tools, and Evan was very, very clear with that. He just says, "Hey, even in the pre-chat, because I said, well, what was your role in Pro Tools?" He said to me, he goes, "I had very little to do with it. That was all Mark." I went, "Who?" Because I had, I'd barely seen the name mentioned anywhere, and it hadn't triggered. And then after Evan's initial phone call, phone chat or live chat, I went, "No, this has got to change."
Oh, that's very nice of you. I wouldn't protest if Wikipedia had my name somewhere involved in the Pro Tools entry.
What is with? I mean, you can't even edit. It's apparently supposed to be editable by the community, and I bet you if you tried to put your name in there, they'd edit it out.
Well, I think it is simple now that so I understand. So first of all, let me give you my perspective on all this. Mm-hmm. I get it that there are too many contributors to Pro Tools to really be fair to everybody.
Of course.
And yes, I was the first, and there's other people, Dave Connery, and I'm going to mention Paul Virtualotti again. I'm going to actually mention a few other names in a moment. Mm-hmm. That, and then it's sort of like, well, where do you draw the line? So I think that somebody with some good, astute political sense said, well, Peter and Evan were the founders of the company. Let's just say that they invented the thing. And, and people can know that that wasn't just them doing it. And so I actually respect that whoever made that decision, that's fine. Mm-hmm. I think that there is room to elaborate a little bit, and we'll figure out ways to do that. And, other than that, I would say that, Digidesign was sort of grew up a little more quickly than maybe the folks at Steinberg my perception is that those companies were either a little smaller or had more of a dominant, like there's somebody who is the architect. Like you look at Gerhardt, who, was the guy.
At Ableton.
Well, no, Gerhardt. Okay, well, I'm thinking of Gerhardt from that developed the code that's now Logic.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Yes. Okay.
Gerhardt Langling, I think is his last name. I probably butchered it, but in any case, I think he went from being an individual, like maybe the only writer of it, to being the CTO or something.
Yes.
And as I described previously, I was never particularly interested in being a CTO because I'm not really would have been very good at it. So, maybe their stories are a little different why they are a bit more prominently associated with the software they developed than I am. I don't know. It's just not something I lose sleep over, but like I said, I a little acknowledge isn't bad. And actually my daughter Zoe reminds me that I should, have my name out there a little more.
Get your name out there a little bit more. Well, look, I'm hoping that this actually does that because, you were, well, Evan said you were the godfather. Well, you're not the godfather. You fathered it, and mm-hmm. At least those first 3 versions. And then as you detailed, then at version 4, there was more of a, they brought in the team because everything was expanding at that light,
sure.
that light speed. So, look, I'm very happy that we've got that covered now because it was something that not miffed me, but it was a concern for me that you didn't have a footprint. And
well, I'm glad to have you in my corner. My God, that's great. So listen, I'm going to just do this since we're doing acknowledgement. I can't finish this little podcast here without mentioning just a few more names.
Go.
And I'm going to mention Jim West,
mm-hmm.
who was on early on and continues to work at AVID, and he's more of a kind of product/project manager, but significant contributor to the code. Andy Hall, who's now at Universal Audio, as well as Doug Tissier, both. We've actually have a little thing where we're kind of, some people go from AVID to Universal for good reason, because they make good products.
And then come back, yeah.
And some of them come back.
Yeah.
Andy Hall, absolutely instrumental in major stuff. Steven Wilson, can't finish this without Steven Wilson. Ted Barham, and also Pete Wilcox. Pete Wilcox being more on the sort of satellite link video engine, but Pro Tools side of things, but with a very much of a focus on I guess video post as opposed to music creation or something like that.
Yeah, awesome.
So and I forgot some names, and I apologize to whoever I forgot, but those names had to be mentioned.
I've got one more that you mentioned to me during the week.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Opcode.
Of course, Dave is a great contributor to Pro Tools, has been doing it since about 2000, I guess.
99. I looked it all up. So, and how do you pronounce his surname? Was it Oppenheimer?
Oppenheim. That's how I...
Oppenheim.
Oppenheim.
And that's where opcode came from. There.
Yes, opcode. So we go back, we're almost going full circle. So opcode created something called Sequencer, and then they got a little more imaginative and called their product Vision.
And Studio Vision.
And then Studio Vision indicated the incorporation of Digidesign's digital audio technology. And
that's something that I had not realized that they were the first. Because one of the conversations that I've had with one of the subject matters that I've spoken to several of the DAW developers is how do they manage audio time versus musical time. Now, this is a long conversation, and I reckon we're going to do this on part 2 when you come back, because you are coming back, Mark, by the way.
Oh, really?
Well, I hope so.
Okay, great.
Oh, by the way, you're quite welcome to be coming back again, Mark.
Wow.
And see, I got ahead of myself then. So the whole thing with musical time versus audio time, which a lot of the developers struggle with, and again, we didn't cover it this time, but I think that could be another one that we could actually dive into. So to hear that Studio Vision had done that so early on, because I was across it, but somehow I blurred the line that I thought Studio Vision came much later.
No. HD Play. Yeah. So HD Play was the name of the very unimaginative name, but hard disk playback, so that you could play back audio within, any third party app. Well, any basically amounted to, Studio Vision and, actually take that back. Actually, I forget. Maybe it was only that, because then we did TDM, and then TDM support was, of course, in Logic, and it was in Motu, Performer, and things like that. And then it really just became difficult to support, and it stopped working for a lot of those guys. And then by then, I think they figured out that they wanted to have their own digital audio. And then, of course, there was new plugin formats to support AAX and AUX, or AX plugins. And VST and things like that.
Yeah. And Steinberg's TDM implementation was, we'll call it lacking.
Yeah. All right, I got to correct myself. I said it's AU. Plugin.
AU. It's okay.
I got too much of the alphabet floating in my brain here.
I think we're getting to that point of the podcast. Just one final thing, really quickly. Your thoughts on the current landscape with music technology in general. Do you have anything you can share with that?
Part 2. I think. I have a lot of thoughts, because it is sort of a thing that there's a tension between all of the possibilities and human expression, and like how we, let's do this in part 2. I've been spending a lot of time in a great product, Max MSP, right?
Yes.
Cycling 74.
Yes.
And really cool stuff there. Yeah, I as much as I'm talking about writing software, I'm a major user of software, and am very involved in physical modeling plugins, and I love it. I love making music. Nobody cares to listen to the music I make, but that's all right. Anyways, so great question, but I think that my creative part of my brain is spent to fully articulate all those thoughts. So I'm going to leave it to part 2.
Awesome. All right. Well, with that, I'd like to thank both of you guys again for your time and energy. That has been awesome. We've covered a stack of stuff. So, and we're at over the 2-hour mark. So I think let's put a pin. We'll put a pin in it.
Yeah,
right.
We should.
And I was very presumptuous when I said you're coming back a second time.
I'd be honored to.
You're more than welcome to come back a second time, and we can pick up the ball there and just move on, because I think there'll probably be some more things that we can chat about. I am sure. All right. With that, on to the next.